All right, why don't we get started? We're going to continue today with the social insurance section of the course. As I said, with each section, we sort of open with a bit of a theory chapter. That's what we did last time, sort of laying the groundwork for thinking about optimal social insurance. What we're going to do now is apply that theory to a number of cases. Today, we'll talk about Social Security. On Monday, we will talk about, wait, the midterm's Monday or Wednesday? Monday. We'll talk about anything. You guys can take the midterm. On Wednesday, we'll then come back and talk about other programs like unemployment insurance and workers' compensation disability insurance. And then we'll go into a series of lectures on healthcare. The midterm will not cover today's lecture. Don't leave. Still matters for the final. But the midterm will not cover today's lecture, but it will. You will be responsible for the stuff we covered on Monday on basics of social insurance theory. But the Social Security specifics will not be on the midterm. Music recommendation day is a terrific pop band called Last Dinosaurs. Their song Bass God is very catchy. They're actually opening act for a show Friday night at downtown Boston. It's an early show, 6:30 p.m. at the Royale, so you can go there and still come back and go to your party or whatever. But I recommend the whole concert. Bad Sons is the main act, but it's going to be a terrific pop show. So we'll do today is we're going to go through Social Security institutions, how Social Security redistributes money, optimal Social Security, and then Social Security reform ideas. In each of these lectures that I'll do over the next several weeks, there's a trade-off between telling you as much as you need to know about how the programs work to think about the economics, but not so much that it's boring. So I'm going to give you a lot of institutional detail about how these programs work. Trust me, it's the minimum you need to know to understand the programs, but please feel free to ask for more. I'd love to talk about how these programs work ad nauseum. So please feel free to ask for more detail if you don't quite understand how a program works or whatever, because I'm just sort of giving you the minimum. It's going to seem like a lot, but something you need to know to really sort of understand how to think about the economics of these programs. And today we'll start with Social Security, which is really the single largest social insurance program that the government runs. Basically, how does Social Security work? Okay, the basics are pretty simple. You pay a tax called the FICA tax. So you pay those Social Security institutions. It's financed by the FICA tax. Okay, that's on your pay stub. You ever seen FICA on your pay stub? That tax is 6.2% each of your wages on the employer and the employee. So both each you and your employee and your employer pay 6.2% of your wages in FICA tax. Okay, up to currently about 125K of earnings. And then after that, you don't pay anymore. So I think tax up to about 125K, which is pretty high in the earnings distribution. That's probably about the 95th percentile of the earnings distribution. Okay, so most Americans pay tax on all their earnings. Maybe it's the 92nd or something. It's pretty high up. And that's what finances the program. Okay. What does it pay for? Well, it pays for benefits that you get if you're retired or disabled. So let's talk about more specifics. In particular, who's eligible? To be eligible, you have to meet two criteria. You have to be 62 or older, and you have to have worked 40 quarters. Yeah, or 10 years, but it doesn't have to be 10 consecutive years. You have to have worked 40 quarters. You have to earn a minimum amount in 40 quarters over your career. So you have to be some minimal attachment to the labor force. What do you get if you qualify for Social Security? Well, that's pretty confusing. So let me just sort of go through it. What you're going to get is when you qualify for Social Security, what do you get? The benefit. You get an annuity payment. Annuities are the opposite of life insurance. Life insurance is money your decedents get when you die. Annuities are money that lasts until you die. So it's a check you get until you die. It's an annuity payment. Okay. The amount that you get is a function of what you've earned in your 35 highest years of earnings. So if your career, so basically the amount you get is a function of what your 35 highest years of earnings. Now, and basically what they do is they take your average, they take everything you earn over those 35 years and they average it to get your average index monthly earnings. There's a bunch of terms we're going to come up here. Amy, your average index monthly earnings. They take the amount you earn, they basically put it in real terms so you can compare over time. They add it up over the 35 years. If you only work 30 years, you get 5 years of zeros. Okay, they add it up over the highest 35 years of your career. So if your career is 30 years, that's 5 years of zeros. So if it's 20 years, it's 15 years of zeros. Okay. Now, why 35 years? Well, there's not to say 35 is the right number, but basically we're trading off two things here. On the one hand, you take someone like me. Okay, so my regular career will probably last around 40 years. So probably around 40 years, maybe a little less. But I had a bunch of jobs before I became a professor. Like my first job, I ran the merry-go-round at the local mall. I was a pool boy at the local country club. I did a bunch of stuff where I didn't make a whole lot of money. And it seems silly to base my Social Security earnings on money I made running a merry-go-round at the mall in 1978. Okay, so the idea is you want to base it on sort of a career. But then the other I say, well, then that's fine. Then why not make it much shorter? Why not make it the last 5 years or the last 1 year of your career? The problem then is that can lead to perverse incentives. And I have some examples of that in the book. For example, there was a 61-year-old MBTA operator here in Boston who fell asleep at the controls of the MBTA and caused a crash. Why did he fall asleep? Well, it turned out the MBTA calculated your pension based on your last 5 years of work. So that meant the last 5 years, people wanted to work like crazy to basically get their earnings as high as possible to get the biggest possible pension. Okay, so this guy stayed up like 25 hours straight working to get a high wage, and it caused the crash. Even more is for Brazil, which for a long time your pension benefits were your retention benefits you got until you died were 100% of your last month's salary. So literally, whatever you're in the last month, you got that to retire. So notably, there's a lot of raises in the last month because it wasn't on employers, it was on the government. In particular, huge swaths of the Brazilian military got promoted to general in the last month before they retired, because then they get a huge pension, and who cares? The employer goes on the government. So basically, that's why I have 35 years. Okay, so I'm trying to balance out those two concerns. So you have your AMI, your average index monthly earnings. That is your sort of base. From that base, you compute your PIA, primary insurance amount. Your primary insurance amount is the amount on which your benefits are based. It's not your benefits yet. We're not there yet. Okay. And that calculation, and the way that's translated is represented in figure 13.1. Basically, your PIA is a redistributive function of your AIME. So on the x-axis here is your AIME, just think it's your average earnings over your career. On the y-axis is the PIA. Okay, so basically what that's saying is for the first, so the slopes are for the first $996, every $1 of AIME translates to 90 cents in PIA. For the next $5,000, every 32 cents in AIME, every $1 in AIME translates to 32 cents in PIA. Then the slope goes to 15 cents, and then it ends. And it ends because at that point you're not paying taxes above 125,000, so we're not going to give you benefits for the amount you earned above 125,000. Okay, so basically what this is saying is essentially all you need to know. You don't need to know the bend points here. All you need to know is that the bottom line is that the benefit is a redistributive function of your lifetime, of your average lifetime earnings. Okay, so this means that basically, when we talk about social insurance programs, we're going to talk a lot about replacement rates. The replacement rate. The replacement rate we're going to define as your benefits over your pre-event earnings, which in this case, event would be retirement. But in general, for unemployment insurance, talking about your benefits over what you earned before you lost your job, etc. That's the replacement rate. How much of your pre-event earnings is being replaced? And for the typical worker, Social Security replaces about 40% of their pre-event earnings. But it varies. If you're very poor, it's closer to 90%. Very rich, it asymptotes to 0. Okay, so basically, it's a redistributive. The replacement average is 40%, but it's redistributive. Okay, so and then that determines your PIA. Okay, then from there, you actually move from your PIA to your benefit. Once again, stop me if this is at all not clear. If you have other questions. Okay, yeah.
Why is it less than or shouldn't there be some percent?
Well, we learned last time. What do we know about 100% social insurance replacement? As long as there's any moral hazard, it's never optimal, right? So clearly they've decided they want to keep below 100. Now, is 40 on average and 190 at the bottom right? We're going to talk about that this lecture. But that's a clear argument for being less than 100. Good question. Okay, so basically, then what is your actual benefit? Well, your benefit depends on when you retire. Your benefit depends on when you retire. Okay, actually, let's be clear. It depends on when you claim Social Security. Okay, let me clear. As I'll say in a few minutes, you don't have to retire to claim Social Security. So it depends on when you claim Social Security. If you claim Social Security at what's called at age 67, which is called the full benefit age, then you get your PIA. So if you claim your Social Security benefits at 67, which is called the full benefit age, you get your PIA. Okay, but you can claim it earlier or later. You can claim your Social Security benefits as early as 62. Age 62 is what we call the early entitlement age. So 67 is the full benefit age. 62 is the early entitlement age. You can claim benefits early as 62. Well, think about how this works. You're going to get a check till you die, regardless of when you claim it. So this says that, well, gee, why not claim it as early as possible? Because you get a check till you die either way. And the reason you don't is because the government's smarter than that. And those who claim earlier get penalized. The earlier you claim, the more you get penalized. Okay? And there is what's called an actuarial reduction. I'm not going to tell you the amounts, it's complicated, it doesn't matter. But the bottom line is the bottom line is if you retire at 62, you only get 70% as much. It's a complicated formula. But the thing you need to know is retire at 62, you only get 70% as much if you retire at age 67. Okay, retire at 63, you get 77% as much, etc. It goes up. The close 67 you retire, the more you get. The approach. So basically, you get your PIA at 67. For every month before 67 you retire, you get slightly less. So basically, the trade-off is the earlier you claim, the more months you get of a smaller check. Okay, you can also wait to age 70 to claim. You have to claim by age 70. And if you wait to 70, they make your check bigger every month. They have something called the delayed retirement credit. It's really getting ridiculous with the acronyms. They're all laid out in the book. Okay, the delayed retirement credit, which is basically instead of getting your PIA, you get like 1.08. If you're retired at 70, you get like 1.2 times your PIA or something. You get more than your PIA. So basically, PIA benefit is a function of PIA, but it's not exactly PIA unless you retire right at 67. Otherwise, it's either if you retire before 67, it's a less than 1 fraction of PIA. If you retire after 67, it's a greater than 1 fraction of PIA. Yeah.
If you claim at the age of 62, for example, is it like the whole forever that you get like 70%?
Yes, exactly.
Not that after.
No, forever. Because so yes, yeah.
Oh, what is the purpose of them like letting you choose? It seems like you're like just making a choice based on how long you think you're gonna live or something.
That's an excellent question. We're gonna come back to that. Okay. So basically, so that's basically what you get. Now you'll notice that I caught myself when I said the age of retirement, said the age of claiming. It turns out you can claim your Social Security without retiring. Now, to be clear, 90% of people claim it when they retire, but you don't have to. You can claim Social Security to continue to work. The difference is, if you claim Social Security to continue to work between 62 and 67, we have something called the earnings test. And the way the earnings test works is for every dollar you earn above some level, your benefits get clawed back. So the way it works is right now, you don't need to know the numbers. This is a lot to remember. But right now that level is $19,000. So basically you can earn up to $19,000 and if you claim Social Security, you can earn up to $19,000, no one cares. But once you're above $19,000, for every dollar you earn, they take back 50 cents of Social Security benefits. That's called the earnings test. So the first 19,000 is exempt. But then if you want to claim at 62 and keep working, for every dollar of benefits above 19,000, I'm going to take back 50 cents of your benefits. Okay. Critically, this is not a tax. It's forced savings. Most Americans think it's a tax. Most Americans say, well, I'm going to lose 50% of my Social Security benefits if I work. Actually, it's not true at all. What they do is they hang on to it and give it back to you when you actually do retire. So it's a forced savings program. We'll come back later to why that might be optimal to think about. Okay, so forced saving program. So basically, you don't have to stop working to claim benefits. But if you're going to keep working and you're going to make more than 19,000, we're going to force you to save some of your benefits and pay them out when you actually do retire. Okay, so it's like a forced savings program for people. And we can talk later about why you might want that. Okay. Lastly, there are family benefits. Okay. There is a spousal benefit, which is determined as your spouse gets the bigger of their own benefit or 50% of your benefit. The spouse gets the bigger of the benefit they would have on their own earnings or 50% of what they get on your earnings and vice versa across both spouses. Okay. So these things, because one spouse never works, the couple gets 1.5 times the working spouse's Social Security. If both spouses work and have the same benefits, you just get 2 times that benefit level. Okay? So it's the bigger of the spouse's own entitlement on their own earnings and 50% of the other spouse's entitlement. There is a survivor benefit, which is when one spouse dies, the other spouse gets whichever benefit is larger. Okay? So the spouse gets, when one spouse dies, the other spouse gets either they keep getting their own benefit or they can switch their spouse's benefit that was bigger. And then finally, and sort of the thing you need to know the least, there are also children's benefits. Some people in Social Security still have kids, and you can get a small amount for your kids, but it doesn't add up too much. Okay? So that is how Social Security works. Questions about that? A lot to know, but yeah.
How does the money itself actually get claimed? Can it only be claimed by the person that it's assigned to, or is it like a check thing? Is it like?
I mean, basically, you go to the Social Security office, you file your Social Security, say, like, file Social Security, and then once you do, they send you a check every month.
Okay, and check has to be checked out by the person that's being assigned to.
When it has to be checked
Like,
out.
I guess
No, they mail it to you every month.
Okay, like this is a theoretical situation. Say grandma gets Social Security benefit and then she dies. But what if you just don't tell anybody she died? Does that mean you continuously?
Social Security has records. Social Security knows when you die. They have death records.
What if you just don't?
If you don't have death records, send the check. There are people who still get Social Security checks many years after they die, and as a scam. That's right. But typically, Social Security is pretty good to know about knowing that you died. Yeah.
For the spousal, for the survival benefit, if do the spouses both have to be on Social Security for that to work, or does one of them have to be?
They both have to be eligible for. Actually, that's a good question.
So they both have.
Every year I get a question I can't answer on this topic. Does the spouse have to be eligible for Social Security to get the survivor benefit? I think not. They don't have to be eligible to get the spouse. Yeah, I think not.
Okay, so
Basically, it's a survivor benefit. You just get, and same with spousal benefit. To get there, the 50%, you don't have to yourself be eligible. Yeah, I'm pretty sure about that.
meaning you don't even have to be age eligible?
No, if you age eligible, but you don't have to be like earnings eligible.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah,
Is it only for like US citizens? Like what if your spouse is like a foreign national or something?
it is for people who work legally in the US. You don't have to be US citizen. Yeah,
This is like similar to the question about why they would allow you to choose, but like if the idea for Social Security is to like get benefits after like you're unable to work, why would they let you like continue to work while getting them?
that's a great question. And once again, let's come back to that. I want you, remind me if we don't get back to these questions, because hopefully we'll answer these by the end of the lecture. Other questions about how it works. Okay, one other neat fact. You didn't ask me how long do you have to be married to be a spouse. It turns out it's 10 years. So it's possible if you married optimally every 10 years over a 50-year period, you could have 5 people getting spousal benefits on your check. So there is that. Yeah.
Oh, also like on like the FICA tax, why
Yeah.
do they have like a specific tax on it such that they're like drawing from the pool instead of just normally funding it through like fiscal policy?
Another good question we'll come back to. Okay. All right. So let's go on. And I want to talk, the first thing so that's the institution deals. The first thing I want to talk about is I want to talk about how Social Security redistributes. How the Social Security program redistributes money. Okay. So basically, if we think about a typical, it's a little bit related to your last question. Think about a typical pension plan. A typical pension plan is what's called funded. What funded means is when MIT sets up a pension plan to pay me, for every dollar they promise to pay me, they must have a dollar in assets that they can tap to pay me when it's due. Okay, an expectation at least. There's an asset balance behind the promise they've made. Social Security, on the other hand, is unfunded. There are no assets behind Social Security, at least at times. It's changed over time. But Social Security is not a real savings plan. It's essentially something where people pay taxes. Those taxes go right out to pay the people who are getting benefits. Okay, it's a transfer from the young to the old. It is not savings by people when they're young to get when they're old. It is a transfer from the young to the old. What that means is a funded pension rests on the fact there are assets in the bank. An unfunded pension is essentially a Ponzi scheme. Okay. Now, some of you may not know. Do all of you know what a Ponzi scheme is? Okay, I'm curious. Let me describe how a Ponzi scheme works. Let's say that I went to I teach 2 classes. Let's say I went to 1401 at 11 a.m. and I said, hey, if each of you gives me $1 on Monday, on Wednesday I'll give you back $2. And they all want to get good grades, so they'll give me the $1. Okay. I then come here. I say to you all, hey, if you guys give me $3 on Wednesday, I'll give you back $5. So you're like, fine, you like the grades, you give it to me. I take your $3, I take $2 of it. I go back on Wednesday and give it to the 1401 kids. They're like, wow, this worked. I got a better deal for you. If you give me $6, then next month I'll give you back $5 and I come to you, etc. Okay? What's behind that? Only your desire to make me happy is behind that. If you eventually said, you know what, I don't care about my grade, I'm not giving this guy $157, the whole thing collapses because there's nothing real behind it. Okay, all that's behind is that more people are going to play in the future. All that's behind Social Security, the largest single social insurance program in our nation's history, is the promise that the government will pay out. There's nothing real behind it. Okay, all that's behind that is the promise that the government will pay out. God, I keep forgetting. You guys remind me to put this thing on. Put that on. I don't know. Do we know if it catches anything if I don't have it on?
I think it does, because
Okay.
the room has my, like, those things are also my.
Okay, awesome. So basically, you've got this scheme, which is basically backed not by assets, but by trust in the government. Okay. Now, in reality, there is actually a small, what's called Social Security Trust Fund. There is actual, we'll talk later about where that came from. But in reality, taxes just don't go right out the door to people. Taxes come into a trust fund, which exists. But that trust fund is only enough to pay benefits through 2035. Okay. After that, the trust fund runs out of money, and we'll come back and talk about that. So how does Social Security work? Let's look at a simple example through what we call an overlapping generations model. This is one of the many things Paul Samuelson introduced economics, and Peter Diamond and another Nobel Prize winner in economics department sort of perfected, is the overlapping generations model. So it's the model looks as follows. Look at table 13.1. It's a model where everybody lives for 2 periods, but the second period for the first generation is the first period for the second generation. So for example, you've got in period 1, there's 100 people that are, immaculately produced on Earth. Okay. They each earn $20,000 and there's no social security program. In period 2, those 100 people become old and there's now 105 more young people. So every year there's 5% more young people. It's a growing population. So every year there's 5% more young people, and the people who from the period before become old. So in period 2, the 100 people from period 1 who were young are now old. There's now 105 workers. Now we're going to introduce the Social Security program. Look at earnings per worker. We're going to assume that population goes up by 5% a year, and we're going to assume 5% productivity growth. So we say N, which is population, is going to have 5% a year. And we assume G, which is productivity, is also going to go 5% a year. Okay? What that means is earnings go up 5% every year too. So the young workers in period 2 earn 5% more. So it's 5% more young workers earning 5% more each. Now we're going to have a 10% Social Security tax. We're throwing in period 2. Well, in period 2, that means that each young worker pays $2,100 for a total of $220,500. There's 100 retirees. They each get $2,205, which is the total divided by 100. They paid in nothing, so they have an infinite rate of return. Now go to period 3. Period 3 is 110 young workers. They're earning 10% more, which is $22,050. They each pay $22,005 in taxes. That means each of the 105 now old people gets $2,310 in benefits. Now each old person in generation 3 paid $2,100 in taxes when they were young, so they have a 10% rate of return. And so on, until you get to the last generation. Let's say the government says we're not running Social Security anymore. We've had it with Social Security. Well, then there's 121 young workers. They don't pay anything in taxes. There's 115 retirees. They get no benefits, but they paid $2,315 in taxes. So they end up with a negative 100% rate of return. So what do we learn from this table? We learn 3 things. First of all, with an unfunded Social Security system, the first generation does great. And in fact, this is not academic. It's a great story. The very first beneficiary of Social Security was named Ida Mae Fuller. She was born in 1874 on the same town as Calvin Coolidge, the future president of America. And she worked for only 3 years after Social Security was established and paid a total of $25 and $24.75 in Social Security taxes. On the day that you could register to actually get Social Security benefits, they started collecting taxes before benefits. On the day you could register, she went in that day and went to Rutland, Vermont Social Security office again, the first person ever to apply for Social Security taxes. She says, I wasn't that I expected anything, mind you, but I knew I'd been paying for something called Social Security. I wanted to ask how the people in Rutland wanted to ask them about it. So she became the first person ever to get a check on January 31st, 1940. She got a check for $22.54 after having paid $27 in taxes. But that's not the end of the story, because Ida Mae lived to 100. By the time she died, she had collected $23,000 in Social Security on a $24 tax payment. Okay, that's generation 1. Basically, generation 1 makes out. Why does that make sense? It makes sense because who was generation 1 in reality? The generation had their savings wiped out by the Great Depression. This was set up as an unfunded program on purpose by FDR, because an entire generation had their retirement savings destroyed by the Great Depression, and he wanted to bail them out. So essentially a purposeful bailout of a generation whose savings have been destroyed. So they do great. Okay. What about people in the middle? Well, people in the middle get a rate of return which is equal roughly to N plus G. So in other words, even in a Ponzi scheme, there can be a positive. In my Ponzi scheme, I constantly raise the tax rate. But even without raising the tax rate, a Ponzi scheme can have a rate of return as long as the base grows. as long as the base the next year is bigger than the base of previous year, then there's more money to be paid in. So Ponzi scheme works as long as the base of people, either you need to raise the tax rate you charge people or the base of people you're charging needs to grow. As long as it's growing, then there's more money flowing in. So because population is growing and wages are growing, there's a natural 10% rate of return in this case, the middle generations. And the last generation is screwed. Okay? That's the way it works. So basically, what Social Security has done through being an unfunded system is essentially set up what Peter Diamond called a legacy debt. Legacy debt. The legacy debt is, in some sense, the amount of money Social Security owes because it gave away money to the first generation. Social Security, in some sense, always in debt. It's always behind, which it's got to make up by having this constantly growing population. And the reason people are screwed in this example last generation is because they're basically forced to pay back the debt that we owe on the first generation. So this simple example, the last generation is essentially paying back the money that we need to pay for the first generation on an unfunded basis. So Social Security carries with it this giant debt, which is essentially the PDV of the money it gave away in the first round. And that's what we call the legacy debt. Okay. So that is why people are pretty confident Social Security isn't going to end, because you have a large class of voters who'd be pretty fucking pissed. Okay. The last generation is not going to be very excited. The last generation votes. Remember, old people vote the most. They're not going to be very excited to vote, to say, well, I paid taxes all my life, I'm fine, just not get the benefit. So since the Ponzi scheme of Social Security just rests on trust, it rests on political economy. The idea that a whole generation of elderly voters will not let them cancel the program. Okay. Now, in fact, Social Security doesn't just redistribute. So Social Security redistributes in many ways. And it doesn't actually just even distribute across generations, it redistributes within generations too. And the way we can do that is we can look at, for different groups of workers, we can compute their Social Security wealth. What is Social Security wealth? Social Security wealth is the net present discounted value of all Social Security benefits over your life. It's the net present discounted value of the system. So what I do is I take for every person, I take how much they're going to get in benefits over the rest of their life, minus how much they're going to pay in taxes over the rest of their life. Okay, I discount it, and that's their expected Social Security wealth. It's a PDV because I discount it. It's expected because I do it based on how long I think they'll live. Of course, I don't know. If you live a longer time, you get more money. If you live shorter, you get less. So basically, based on an expected duration of life, I can get an expected net present discounted value of your entitlement under Social Security. And if you do that for different groups, you get what we see in table 13 too. So what this shows, take a look at the average earner. Compare the first column is the first generation. They were the ones who didn't pay much in and got a lot of benefit. The second column is the middle generation. The third column is me. Okay? So basically what you see is the net present discount value is falling dramatically. The first generation made out like bandits. For the average earner, by the third generation, you basically break even. Slightly positive. Okay? And that's because, and why is that? Well, the reason the first generation did better is because they got the gift. Why are later generations doing worse? Later generations are doing worse because N and G are falling. N and G, which were originally quite high, are now falling. N used to be 2.5% a year. It used to be that N plus G was about 4% a year. And now N plus G is under 2% a year. So it used to be we had a naturally rapidly growing Ponzi scheme that's now shrunk. Okay, we're now shrinking. As a result, you have a system which is paying out a lower and lower rate of return over time. Now, obviously, this is assuming that those that the program still exists when I'm there. It's not a giant negative number. Assuming it still exists. This is just saying that basically, if you compare the first column versus the second column, that's about the first generation winning. The second column versus the third column, that's about N plus G falling. That's about the fact that the Ponzi is becoming a worse and worse deal because N plus G are getting smaller, is getting smaller and smaller. You also see that this varies by earnings. look down the first column. For the first generation, the richer you are, the more money you make. Why? Well, because this is a great system, and the richer you are, the more you invested in the system. You invested a share of your taxes. The richer you are, the more you paid in taxes, the more you got to be invested in this great system. But the flip, of course, is the last column, which is now the richer you are, the worse off you are. It's now a system that doesn't have a very good rate of return. You're forced to be in at high levels. So basically, it's now Social Security's gone from actually not being a very redistributive system to being a very redistributive system in a lifetime basis. Okay, those who are rich over their life end up losing money. Those who are poor over their life end up making money. Okay, yeah.
If the government really wanted to cancel the program, then couldn't they just give everyone back like the taxes that they paid?
We'll come back to that. I keep answering. Well, I promise we'll come back to all this. I'm a fast talker. We'll get there. One other point. This is not the only redistribution in the system. There's other redistribution. For example, who does better off Social Security? Single men or single women? Yeah, because they live longer, pay the same taxes while you're working, but basically you get more years of benefits. What about single people versus married couples? Who does better? So imagine a single person, yeah, because they get 150% of the benefits. Married couples do better. Now here's a more interesting one. What about a single earning couple versus two earning couples? A single earning couple versus two earning couples. So imagine that you have basically a family with one single earner, and then versus you, one single earner, a wife who doesn't work, a spouse who doesn't work. I'm sorry, I'm still back in my generation. A spouse who doesn't work. There's another family and a spouse who works. Okay, who does better? Let's get some other answers. Who does better? Yeah.
The single earning one?
The single earning one does better per dollar. So who has more depends on how much the spouse earns, of course. But in terms of per dollar of taxes, the single does much better. Because basically, think about how much Social Security screws working spouses, typically working women, because they're typically secondary earners. If your benefit is 49.9% as big as your spouse, it's worthless. Because you're going to get 50% anyway. So unless your earnings is at least 50% of what your spouse was making, unless your benefit is 50%, then you get no return from working as a secondary earner. So it's really unfair to sort of a family with two workers where one is much higher income than another. Because that other worker, they would get 50% of the spouse benefits no matter what. So all the Social Security taxes they're paying are just thrown away. Yeah.
Those are capped at 125.
Yeah, they're capped at
So like
125.
if one person made 10 million, another person made-
Yeah, no, it's capped.
It's
Yeah, subject to that cap. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah.
What happens to if like the average human lifespan, like somebody increases by like 40 or 50 years?
Well, that's exactly what happened. We'll talk about that. Okay. So let's talk about, but first I want to talk about, we're going to get that when we talk about Social Security reform. But first I want to talk about optimal Social Security. Basically apply what we learned in chapter 12 to the case of Social Security. Well, optimal Social Security is going to involve evaluating our rule from last time, which is that the benefits, you want to set Social Security benefits such that the benefits for consumption smoothing equal the cost due to moral hazard. Let's focus on the consumption smoothing side. What's the benefits from consumption smoothing is basically the idea that individuals will not save optimally, will not have optimal self-insurance for the retirement, which is sort of weird because it's totally predictable, right? We're all going to retire. So in some sense, remember, we said self-insurance would be self-insurance is least valuable when things are big and unpredictable. Retirement's big, but it's pretty predictable. Now, the exact date might not be predictable. We all know we're going to retire. So in some sense, you could say it's not clear there's going to be much consumption smoothing value from Social Security. All it might do is just crowd out the savings that people had. Like my aunt who worked in Minnesota, who literally knew she'd be unemployed every summer. She didn't need unemployment insurance. She could just save during the year to pay it. So all the unemployment insurance did was crowd out her savings. You could say the same thing about Social Security. Everyone knows they're going to retire. They would save, so it's crowded out. On the other hand, we know, you learned in the past, we'll talk about in chapter 22, that saving decisions are made far from optimally in the US. Basically, half the US population has less than $500 in liquid savings. Okay, so it's not clear that would happen. It's not clear that the rational model that would imply a full crowd out is really going to happen. So what articles have done is they've actually tried to test how big is the consumption smoothing effect of Social Security. And they've done that in really two different ways. There's 2 ways to go about that. One way is to ask, well, literally look at consumption on retirement. How much is it smoothed by Social Security? And one way to look at that is to look at what Social Security has done to poverty rates. And if you look at figure 13.2, this shows what's happened to Social Security spending over time in the elderly poverty rate. And there's obviously huge negative correlation. If there was full self-insurance, there should be no correlation. Elders in poverty could depend on being poor, but it shouldn't depend on Social Security because it's just being crowded out. And indeed, while this is just a time series graphic to kind of beat up in chapter 3, I've written an article which uses quasi-experimental design. Some generations randomly get much bigger benefits than other generations to show that there's essentially this entire time series can be explained is causal. That basically Social Security had dramatic effect in lowering the poverty of the elderly, which would not be true if it was just crowding out savings. So that's one way to look at it, is look directly at sort of consumption or living standards. The flip side is to actually just measure crowd out, right? So in some sense, consumption smoothing is the complement of crowd out. You can measure consumption smoothing, you can measure crowd out. So there's been a bunch of articles which have asked, how does Social Security affect savings? Retirement savings. And the bottom line, I go through the articles in the paper, in the book. The bottom line is it looks like there's about 40% crowd out. That is for every dollar of Social Security benefits, every dollar of Social Security wealth that people have when they retire, their savings is about 40 cents lower. So there is crowd out, but it's much less than full. Okay, and this is done from some cool studies, like for example, looking at other countries where they cut pension benefits for some workers and not other workers. And what they found is the workers where pension benefits got cut saved more, but not that much more. So the bottom line is it looks like Social Security smoothed consumption, but it smoothed consumption, but not fully, partially, which once again is going to say, well, then if there's any moral hazard, clearly we don't want Social Security to be fully, we want 100% Social Security benefit. Okay. So what about the moral hazard side? Remember, we want to measure the consumption smoothing benefits against the moral hazard costs. Consumption smoothing benefits, clearly Social Security is doing some consumption smoothing, maybe 60 cents on every dollar. What about the moral hazard cost? Well, the moral hazard cost is the notion that Social Security might induce you to retire earlier because you get this benefit. Okay. And indeed, if you look at figure 13.3 and you stopped in 1989, once again, you see a striking negative correlation. As Social Security gets more generous over time, the labor force participation of older worker falls. The problem is that doesn't work anymore after about 1989. They actually moved together at the end of the period. So the time series isn't very constructive on this. Okay. So there's been a number of studies using a number of different methodologies which have tried to look at the effect of Social Security on retirement, try to get causal estimates. Okay. And basically, it's pretty clear Social Security has a big effect on retirement. One way to illustrate that is through looking at what we call the retirement hazard rate. So look at figure 13.4. Figure 13.4 is the rate at which people working at each age exit the labor force. So in other words, at age 60, if you're working at your 60th birthday, 1 3/4% people leave the labor force over the next year. Okay. If you're working at your 70th birthday, about 2% of people leave the labor force over the next year. If you're working at your 62nd birthday, which happens to be the early entitlement age, there's a huge spike. On your 67th, well, this is when the full benefit age used to be 65, now it's 67. When it was 65, there was also a huge spike. These are consistent with Social Security having effect. There's no reason inherently why people's taste for retirement should suddenly change at 62 and 65. Okay. The fact there's these giant spikes, the fact that suddenly a bunch of people want to retire is consistent with Social Security having an effect. Okay, so that is one piece of evidence. The other piece of evidence, and so related piece of evidence, but the problem with that is you could say, well, I don't know, maybe people just like quitting at 62 because like that's in the human biology. Okay, so that motivated a giant project I did as a young man, where we actually, in the late 1990s, we put together a team of people from each country across 12 countries around the world to measure what is the retirement incentives inherent in each Social Security system. So remember how to find Social Security wealth over somewhere over here. So somewhere to find Social Security wealth. The net present discounted value of Social Security benefits. We can take that and we can define an implicit tax rate of Social Security. What is the implicit tax rate on working another year? Well, the implicit tax rate on working another year is the delta in your Social Security wealth from working that year over the wage you could earn if you worked that year. Now, why would Social Security wealth change if you work another year? There's actually 4 reasons. Think about how I define the US system. Now I'm going to test your institutional knowledge. There's 4 reasons why if you work one more year past 62, your Social Security wealth changes. What are the 4 reasons? Whoever goes first gets the easiest one. Yeah.
One more check.
You get one more check. And that's going to, so you get more years, and that's going to raise your Social Security wealth from working more. Second reason. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
If you make like your top 35.
Yep. Your PIA is going to, your AMI is going to go up, which is going to raise your PIA. Okay. So 2 reasons why you get more money if you if you work one, you get one fewer year. Let's say what is he said, if you work more years, you get one fewer year benefits. That's a negative. Okay, so with the thought experiment we're doing is working one more year, working your 62nd year, say. So you're at your 62nd birthday, you're deciding whether to work. Well, on the one hand, if you work, you get one fewer years of checks. That's bad. And then your average earnings goes up. That's good. What else? Yeah.
Rate for like recurring 62, 67.
The actuarial adjustment, which says that by working another year, you get more per month. So that's good. What's the 4th effect of working another year? On the net present discounted value of Social Security. Notice the net. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned that if you like pay, or you're getting more benefit. Wait, no, that's like volume. Sorry.
Yeah. What else? Remember the very first thing we talked about, the system. What's the other effect of working another year that comes through Social Security? You got to pay the tax. You got to pay FICA, right? If you work one more year, you got to pay FICA for one more year, which is going to lower your net present discounted value of Social Security wealth. So actually, it's ambiguous whether working one more year raises or lowers the amount you get from Social Security, your net Social Security wealth. Totally ambiguous. Okay. So what we did is we measured across each of these countries, what was the implicit tax in place in your country, factoring these factors in. Turns out in the US, the implicit tax is very low. These things balance quite nicely. Okay. On the other hand, in other countries, the implicit tax is much higher. And the main reason is because many other countries don't have an actuarial adjustment. Take that out, and you can see why it's a bad deal to work another year. Let's take the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, the Social Security replacement rate is about 90%. When you retire, you get about 90% of your benefits, like the poorest people do in the US. And there's no actuarial adjustment, which means your choice is, at age 60, work and earn 100% of your wages, or sit at home and earn 90% of your wages. Okay, but it's worse than that, because if you work, you have to pay payroll tax. Sit at home, you don't. So actually, the implicit tax on working at age 60 in the Netherlands is 141%. You lose money by working because you give up 90% Social Security benefits, okay? And you pay a huge payroll tax, which they need to finance their program because everyone's retired. Okay, so basically, there's a huge variation in implicit taxes across countries. So we looked at what effect that had in retirement in this volume I did, and that's in figure 13.5. So on the x-axis, don't worry about the magnitudes, it's hard to interpret. This is basically like the sum of implicit taxes. Just think of an index of how high implicit taxes are. On the y-axis, the percent of eligible that don't work. Well, in Japan, there's very little disincentive to work, and everyone works. In Belgium and Italy and the Netherlands and France, there's a huge tax on working, and very few people work at older ages. So essentially, that's more evidence. Now, it's just cross-country. There's other reasons why people might work in Japan and not work in Belgium. But it's certainly suggestive that essentially there are, it's certainly suggestive that you see that Social Security is inducing more retirement. So the bottom line is you've got a system which clearly is causing some moral hazard, some significant moral hazard. It's partially smoothing consumption. And what that tells us is we definitely want Social Security benefits to be well south of 100%. Now, I haven't told you whether 40% is optimal, but I can tell you that you definitely wouldn't want, come back to the question, you wouldn't want to touch 100% with a 10-foot pole when you're only smoothing 60% of consumption and there's a big moral hazard component. Okay? Questions about that? Yeah.
The government ever make a system that has implicit tax on working? Isn't it like better for the government for people to work?
Well, great question. We did a whole book on that. And the answer is because governments have an incorrect view of the labor market. They have what they call the lump of labor view. And the lump of labor view is that there's a fixed number of jobs. There's a fixed number of jobs. And so basically the idea is if you get old people out, young people will take them. You note these European countries that have very generous systems also have high youth unemployment rates. So their view is we'll have this big, they know there's big implicit taxes. They're like, good, we'll get the old people out of the job, get the young people into the job. What that misses is it misses the entire supply side economics, which is by having a high tax, you destroy jobs. Okay, and as a result, you shrink the entire economy. You don't just make jobs for young people. Okay, so that's the political economy of it. Okay, so that's kind of rushed, but basically this is, I'm giving an example here of how you apply, we'll do this over and over again next lecture, an example of how you apply the principles of chapter 12 to think about setting up a social insurance system, which is you measure consumption, and you measure the moral hazard, you put them together and try to weigh them and deciding how generous it should be. Now, with a more specific model, I can tell you what the optimal benefits are. Those haven't really been done well for Social Security. I will have that answer for unemployment insurance. Okay, but that's basically how you trade it off. Okay, questions about that? Okay, now we have a little bit less than a half hour to discuss all the exciting topics you guys are bringing up with your great questions, which is what happens now? What happens now in particular, given that the N plus G problem is getting much, much worse. It's getting worse because fertility is falling and age spans are extending. So if you look at figure 13.6, this shows the number of adults per 100 working age people. Okay, what you see is that in 1950, there were 10 older adults per 100 working age, 12. It'll be up above 40 by 2060. That means the Ponzi scheme, the more older people there are per young person, that's more pressure on the Ponzi scheme. Let me put it in a way I find quite striking. Today, there are three states in America, where the percentage of people who are 85 or more is more than 2%. Okay, so in every state except 2, there's fewer than 1 in 50 people is above 85. By 2050, in 43 states, more than 5% of the population will be over 85 years old. Think about that. America in 2050 is going to look older than Florida looks today. Okay? We are going to be a very old nation. And that's because of the baby boom. The baby boom was a huge jump in birth rates in after 1945 to 1965. Those folks are old now, and that follows, but it wasn't just a one-time shock because it's followed by a decline in fertility and increase in lifespans, which is putting enormous pressure on the Ponzi scheme. Okay? The current estimates are that the system as a whole is out of balance by about $18 trillion. That's with a T. But basically, if we don't do anything, we've promised about $18 trillion more in benefits than we'll collect in taxes. So we got to do something. So what do we do? Well, the first step we did in 1983 in the Greenspan Commission. You guys might have heard, you're not getting he's kind of getting old for you guys. Might have heard Alan Greenspan. He was chairman of the Fed for a very long time. He was actually a private sector economist. His first claim to fame was he hosted in the government sector, at least he was the head of what's called the Greenspan Commission. They put that together in a hurry in 1983 because in 1983, Social Security was not going to be able to pay its bill within 6 months. That is, within 6 months, they're approaching the point where the taxes collected would not be enough to pay out the benefits that were owed. So they threw this commission together. You would have thought they should have started earlier. They threw this commission together to try to figure out what to do about it. And what they did is they essentially what they did as a commission is, remember, ultimately, if you want to save Social Security, okay, if you want to fix Social Security, you've either got to collect more in taxes or pay out less in benefits. And they did both. First of all, they paid out less in benefits by raising the retirement age, the full benefit age. The full benefit age used to be 65. They raised it to 67. Okay, they raised the full benefit age. They raised the full benefit age to 67. Okay, now here's the key thing. Here's what you understand: a raise in the full benefit age is simply a benefits cut. Why? Because basically you can still get your benefits at 62. Nothing's changed. The difference is at 62, you used to be able to get 80% of what you got of your PIA. Now you get 70% of your PIA. Why? Because the target date for PIA, to get your PIA, you have to retire at 67, not 65. So changing the full benefit age, all it does is sort of cut the benefits at every age you get. Okay? So it's basically a benefits cut, but wouldn't call the benefits cut. We're not cutting benefits for Americans. We're just raising the retirement age, but it's a benefits cut. Okay? On the tax side, they dramatically increased the payroll tax. In fact, more than they needed, and set up provisions for a large Social Security trust fund. That is, the Greenspan Commission said, we've got all these old people come with the baby boom. What we're going to do is going to increase taxes a lot and put more than we need and put the extra in a trust fund. And that trust fund will be able to draw down as the baby boom comes along. So essentially turn it into a partially funded program. They turned it into a partially funded program. Okay. And that was the solution. That bought us, 1983, bought us about 50 years. Okay. But in 2035, the same thing's going to happen again. The trust fund is going to be depleted by 2035. And once again, benefits owed will exceed taxes collected. So we have an oncoming problem that hopefully we'll give ourselves more than 6 months, but who knows? With this political system, maybe we'll give ourselves a day to deal with. Okay. So what can we do about that? Well, basically, what we can do about that is one of a couple things. One is we can raise taxes. Actually, pretty simple. It turned out if we just take the payroll tax if we take the payroll tax up by 3 percentage points from 12.4 to 15.5, that will add 75 years to the length of the life of the trust fund. Indeed, if we raised it further to 4.7 points, so raise from 12.4 to like 17.1%, that would make the trust fund big enough that forever, we'd have enough money in the trust fund forever, as far as we can tell. Unless birth rates drop dramatically more or age spans increase dramatically more, we'd have enough money in the trust fund forever. So a 5% increase in payroll tax, we're done. Okay, good luck getting elected on that. Okay, so that's one solution. The other solution is say, well, wait a second. We don't have to necessarily just raise the rate of tax. We could also change the base of taxes. For example, we could get rid of the 125K limit. We could raise that, the 125K limit. Okay. So for example, the 125K limit, there is a much larger share of earnings above that level. There's not that many, compared to when Social Security started, there's not that many more workers who are above the limit as the share of the workforce, but there's a lot more earnings above that limit because inequality's grown. So while it's still hitting in a fairly similar place in terms of the distribution of people, it's much lower in terms of the distribution of earnings. There's much more of earnings above that limit. So it seems fairness might say you might want to raise that. That could raise some money. Okay. It's also true that there's some workers in the US that are still out of Social Security. For example, state and local workers are on the Social Security system. Okay, we could bring them in. More immigration would improve the Ponzi scheme, right? Moreover, you might say, well, wait a second, bringing more immigrants, that's not a long run solution. Yeah, you bring them in now, but then they got to get paid when they're old. But remember, the system's now a bad deal. So every high skilled immigrant you bring in, you subsidize Social Security because they're going to pay more in tax than they're going to get when they retire. So it doesn't just help the Ponzi scheme, it helps you in the long run. It's both a short and long run problem to increase at least skilled immigration. It's both a short and long run help to the Social Security system. Does that make sense? Okay, so we could do that. Okay, most interesting is, and coming to some of the questions we got before, is we could raise the retirement age further. For example, we could take 67 up to 70. Okay, lifespans are increasing. If we think that we want sort of a fixed retirement period, then we really should be raising it. People living a lot longer past 67 than they used to. But that would be essentially a benefit cut. Okay, that would be essentially a benefit cut. Now, other countries actually use constantly. Sweden has an interesting system where their retirement age is indexed to life expectancy. Automatically, as life expectancy grows, the retirement age grows proportionally, not 1 year for 1 year, but like half a year for 1 year. The idea being, well, as you live longer, you should have to work longer. There's some sense to that. Okay. But that's just a benefits cut. The real game changer would have changed 62. That's the game changer. Because if you suddenly said people can't get Social Security benefits until they're older, then that could have a very big effect in terms of both the finances of the system and in terms of the disincentive effects of the system. So that raises the really interesting question of how do we feel about the early entitlement age? And this question is confounded by a fundamental challenge. If you go back to figure 13.4, remember there's this big spike at age 62. That spike is despite the fact that actually the implicit tax at 62 is quite small. That's not like there's a giant, in other countries, like in the Netherlands, when you hit the early retirement age, there's a huge tax. In France, fascinating fact, at least we did our book, of those working on their 60th birthday, 2/3 retired in the next year. 2/3, because it was a huge implicit tax. It was crazy to keep working. In the US, that's not the case. The implicit tax is very small. That's not causing that spike. So the question is, why is there that spike? And it turns out there's two competing theories which have two diametrically opposite conclusions for policy. One theory for the spike is liquidity constraints. How would that story go? That story would go that lots of people would like to retire before 62, but they can't afford it because you can't borrow against Social Security legally. You're not allowed to borrow against your Social Security benefits. They cannot be used as collateral for a loan. So let's say you would happily retire at 60, even if with an actual adjustment you got less money. But you can't retire without Social Security and you can't borrow against it. Then you're artificially forced to work to age 62. So in that sense, the spike is being pushed up from the bottom. The idea is if we let people get Social Security benefits whenever they wanted, we'd have less of a spike and more early age retirement. And that would be good. We give people the choice. We ask, why should people have the choice? People should have the choice because remember, we essentially want everyone to work until the marginal value of their leisure equals their wage. That's different for different people. That's why you'd want choice. You want choice because my marginal value of leisure, because I'm a nerd and because I have a high wage, my marginal value is I'm going to want to work forever. Okay. Other people who have very physically demanding jobs and a low wage, they want to quit earlier. The optimal Social Security policy is such that everyone works until the marginal value of leisure is equal to their wage. That's optimal. That's why we want a choice of ages. Okay, so people can tie that to this equation. In the model we have today, if this is true at age 60, tough shit. We still make you work till 62 to get your benefits. That's inefficient. Remember, work is not a virtue. Despite what politicians tell you, if your marginal value leisure is above your wage, you should not be working. It's not like work itself is inherently a good. Work is good if it's higher than what you'd prefer, if it's the thing you'd prefer to do with your time. But if not, we are shrinking the social well-being by forcing people to work who'd rather not be working. Okay? So basically, then this would say, so what would the optimal policy recommendation be? It'd be to let people borrow against Social Security or lower the retirement age. Lower the early retirement age, actually lower it. But there's a competing theory, which is the Homer Simpson view, which is people don't understand how Social Security works, and they say, hey, I can get a check at 62, woohoo, I'm retiring. Not realizing they're gonna be a lot poorer than they would be if they'd worked till 67. That's the behavioral economics people are making mistakes view. That people are making mistakes and claiming benefits too early, okay, because they don't understand this very complicated actuarial adjustment and delayed retirement credit. In that case, this spike is being pushed from above. It's a bunch of people that if you didn't let them get retirement early would work longer. But now are retired 62 because they're falsely jumping at the opportunity to claim their benefits. Okay. The problem is that is a very different policy implication. That says we should raise the age of early retirement. Yeah.
If it's like an information problem, could we like then look at how that spike has changed over time, especially with like the advent of the internet and like new information?
Well, actually, Social Security, it's even more than the internet. Social Security, there used to be this thing called the US mail. I don't know if you guys remember that. And Social Security would actually mail you a mailing, which would tell you, here's what you get if you're retired at 62, here's what you get if you're retired at 65. That actually tell you. People threw it away. Basically, the bottom line, I think economics of information and provision is without forcing people to look at information, they don't pay attention to it. Yeah.
I know a few people like low-income workers who like only look at it when they're near retirement age, surprised that like it's way too low to support like monthly payment or monthly spending.
Right.
How much people like have the situation where they don't really look at Social Security until it's too late and like, you know.
Yeah, well, I mean, basically, there's huge evidence that people claim it too early. They don't think optimally about the long run. In particular, if you look at Social Security and you look at who is still, I remember I showed the elderly poverty rate is way down. In fact, if you think about the war on poverty, which we called the Great Society under Lyndon B. Johnson in the 60s, that's the biggest victory of that war on poverty is the elderly poverty rate. It's gone from 25% to less at 8%. The difference is there's one group that's still very poor, which is very elderly widows are still very poor because a lot of them had husbands who retired the minute they could, not remembering their wives are going to live a ton longer. And therefore the widows are not getting benefits that are as large as they need to live on. There's a big debate about the affordability of Social Security. Many would advocate for a more generous Social Security system rather than a less generous one. Okay. So basically the bottom line is thinking about age 62 is a terrific example in thinking through how policy depends on the underlying model. If the underlying model is no liquidity constraints and no behavioral mistakes, then really the government should allow people to just have an actual reduction that goes all the way down and let people just retire when they want. The only reason to have a minimum retire is because you think people make mistakes. Moreover, that's why the government has the earnings test. Remember, Social Security, if you work past 62 and claim your benefits, they force you to save some of it. Someone asked why. Well, the reason why is because they think you're making a mistake by working. Now, they don't want to say you can't work because maybe you're not making a mistake, but they say if you're going to work, we're going to make sure we save a little extra for you in case you are making a mistake. So the government has some guardrails in there. And as age 62, it has the earnings test. Are the guardrails strong enough? Too strong? For example, there used to be an earnings test past age 65. They got rid of it. Past age 67, I'm sorry now. Once you're 67, you can earn whatever you want and still get your Social Security benefits. They've gotten rid of that guardrail. Should they still have it at 62? Should 62 be higher or lower? We don't really know the answer to that. That's a really interesting policy question going forward, is sort of how do we think about early retirement when we don't really know why people are retiring early? Yeah.
I'm a little confused about the earning test. Like, what's the correlation between like working later in life and not saving?
I mean, basically, we think nobody saves. So that's the bottom line. We think rich guys save, poor guys don't save. But the bottom line is it's just we are worried. We're paternalistically worried about people not saving. not saving.
Why have the forced savings thing only like past to such a late time in their life? Like,
No. Oh, I see. Why not? Because that's a great question. Because if I force people to save before 62, that'd be a new public policy, which would have to get voted on by Congress. This is a hidden forced savings. 90, you are now, 50 of you here, you are now probably 3% of the worldwide people who understand how the earnings test works. Most people think it's just a tax. They think they just lose the money. They don't understand it's actually forced savings. Okay, yeah.
Oh, wait, I still don't understand this. Like, so if the earnings test is once you reach 62, if you choose to continue working, they will make you save. But if you choose to not work, they will not make you save.
Yeah.
So why are they not making the people that don't work?
No, they make you, let's be clear. They make you save. If you work, they basically say, look, you've got enough money from working. We're going to make you save Social Security for when you really need it. Okay. Yeah.
So like, where does the money go? Is it like delivered back to you as a lump sum?
It comes back to you as a higher monthly benefit when you do retire. They essentially tack on the 50% gets saved in an account. It's subject to the actual adjustment. It gets bumped up the later you retire, and then retired, but it adds on to your monthly benefit. So the idea is basically, look, if you're working, you got enough money. You don't need to say, but we're worried if you're working, if you claim benefits, you're just going to be partying too much when you're young and not have money when you're old. Yeah.
Why do the arguments for the early retirement age not apply to the regular retirement age forward increase?
What is the argument for?
So like the liquidity constraints versus.
Oh, because the regular retirement age doesn't have, that's just about what determines your benefit level. There's nothing constraining about the regular retirement, the full benefit age. So like we used to call it the normal retirement age, but that's a wrong. It's just a full benefit age. All it is the point at which PAA pivots. That's all it is. There's nothing real there in terms of, there's nothing real there. Now it is true there's still a spike there. So people still artificially think about that. So in some sense, there's a good point there on the behavioral. There's no liquidity constraint argument because you can get on either side. There is still a behavioral point of, gee, why do we want this full benefit age when suddenly everybody's retiring there for no particular reason? That's a good question. That's a good point. These are great questions. Yeah.
Do we have like a general idea of like how many people actually decide to forego some of, or to actually decide to continue working between like 62 and 66?
Yeah. I don't remember the number, but a non-trivial, I mean, it's not a ton, but it's there's a non-trivial share of people who still work. I don't know how many of them earn above 20,000. That's a good question. Okay. So that's sort of the way we think about it. Let's talk about some more radical reforms to try to save Social Security. So we talked about cutting benefits or raising taxes, and we talked about the issues there. I want to spend the last few minutes on two more radical reforms. One radical reform is to say, look, if you ran a pension fund, the Social Security Trust Fund is invested in US bonds 100%. If you ran a pension fund and you invested all the pension money in US bonds, you'd be fired. Okay. The optimal investment of a pension fund is a mix of assets that includes riskier assets like the stock market. In fact, Social Security Trust Fund is the only pension fund in America that is 100% in bonds. So some would say, gee, why don't we take the Social Security Trust Fund and invest some of it in stocks and get the higher return that comes from the stock market? Okay. Well, the answer is because that high return comes with volatility. So basically, as long as we can leave it in there long enough, we should invest some in the stock market. You guys should not. If you guys are investing in retirement all in bonds, I got to have a talk with you. Okay. The only problem is Social Security Trust Fund is going to run out by 2035. It's not clear. It's clear over every 25-year period over history, the stock market outperforms the bond market. But there are many 10 to 15-year periods over history, the bond market outperforms the stock market. We're now close up to 2035 that it's not clear we want to be in stocks. That'd be kind of risky. Okay. The other problem that people talk about putting Social Security in the stock market, there's two other problems. One is that the government would then start to own a lot of the stock market. And could they start to interfere with capital markets? Could you then have a law which the Democrats proposed, which you can't hold stock in any company that's non-union? Or the Republicans opposed, you can't hold stock in any company that pays for abortions for their employees. And when if the government owned a lot of the stock market, that shit could start moving stock markets around in ways we don't like. The other argument against building the trust fund is sort of a fundamental, serious conservative argument, which is, look, the government can't keep its hands out of the cookie jar. Why make the cookie jar bigger? The bigger you make the trust fund, the more the government's just going to take it to pay for other stuff. Why are we making the cookie jar bigger? What we really need to do is to privatize Social Security. And the conservative proposal on Social Security, which has sort of died out, but which usually in fashion as recently as the George W. Bush presidency, is to say, let's privatize Social Security. Let's make it a funded system where your Social Security payments go into an account with your name on it, and that earns interest. You invest it in whatever you want, like your 401k. And when you retire, you get that money. That has two huge advantages. First of all, it would massively increase savings in the US. Right now, the Social Security system is crowding out savings. You would instead of a system would increase savings, and saving that would increase productivity and more savings in America. That's one big argument. Okay. The second big argument is to get the money out of the government in the hands of the people. And people could then do with it what they will instead of the government using it to, finance crazy things. Okay. However, and I'm not going to do this in the Socratic method because we're out of time. There are a few strong arguments against privatization. To my mind, there's two incredibly strong arguments against privatization, so strong that it's a bad idea. The first problem is, how do you pay the legacy debt? Someone asked this before. Can't we just pay that off? Well, sure, we could just pay that off, but who's going to pay it? If you privatize Social Security, that means going forward, it's a funded system, but someone's still got to pay off the 17.8 trillion we owe to the past generations. Okay. And that is a showstopper. How are you going to pay for that? That would be an enormous tax increase in Americans. That's about 17.8 trillion is about, I don't know, I forget. That's like 6 or 7 years of income tax revenues in the US. Okay, that's a big debt to pay back. Okay. So the first problem is, it's not like you wave a magic wand, turn to a funded system. FDR screwed us on that. Okay. We've got the legacy debt. Okay. So that's the first problem. The second problem is, to my mind, the fundamental conundrum of people arguing for privatization, which is, here's what they're arguing. They're saying people are too stupid to save for their own retirement, but smart enough to allocate their financial portfolios. Right? They're saying we should still have Social Security and make people pay a payroll tax. We should let them decide how to invest it. Okay? That's, of course, ridiculous. Optimal portfolio strategy is one of the hardest things in the world. Okay, saving for retirement is pretty easy. So if you don't trust people to save for retirement, how can you trust them to invest the money once they do? And what do you do when someone invests all their money in some company that goes out of business and then they reach retirement, they've got no money? Then we face the Samaritan's dilemma. Are we really going to let them starve because they invested badly with their retirement account? No, we're going to bail them out. Okay, and that's going to cost even more money. So to my mind, the fundamental conundrum of privatization is the fundamental argument doesn't make sense. Either we should have no Social Security and let people save on their own, or we should have Social Security where people don't get to invest their money. The government decides how to invest your money. And the government could invest your money differently. It could involve the stock market, and that's an open discussion. That one I'm more open on. But the idea that people should get to decide how to invest their retirement that the government's forced them to make really doesn't make sense. Okay, and that's sort of, to me, the fundamental sort of death knell of the privatization. That and the fact we can't afford it because we have to pay the legacy debt are sort of the death knell of the privatization arguments. Now, in the book, I discuss some more mixed strategies you can follow. You can do things which are like partial privatization, where you sort of slowly over time raise the US debt level a little bit and slowly move people into, or have supplemental private accounts on top of Social Security. Okay, so you could basically sort of let Social Security sort of shrink a little bit and then sort of phase into supplemental private account. So that there are compromise approaches that are possible. But the bottom line that we'll discuss in chapter 22 is we save too little for retirement in America. Both privately, we save too little, and Social Security is running out of money. Somehow we need as a society to defer current consumption to future consumption, either through the government or the private sector. More of it needs to happen. That's something we're very bad at in America. Okay, and that's got to happen somewhat. It's happened by raising Social Security taxes. Raise Social Security taxes, you defer current consumption because we pay more on payroll taxes towards future consumption because we get more and more old. You could do it, for example, through mandating retirement savings. Someone talked about that. You could mandate everyone a retirement savings account. That could do it. But the bottom line is we have a problem, which is in the long run, we have promises. We cannot afford the retirement that we all think we're entitled to. And that's got to be dealt with somehow. Okay, I'm going to stop there. It's a long lecture. A lot of details in the book I didn't cover. So if you find that interesting, go back and read all about them. And we will See you Monday for the midterm. Please be here. We'll start at 2:35 sharp, and we'll end at 4 o'clock sharp. It's an 85-minute midterm. Couple of long problems and a couple of short answer problems. As I revealed, the picture of Hannah's dog will be on the exam, and you get 1 extra point for the cutest adjective. Whoever Hannah decides has the best adjective to describe her dog. And other than that, the review session on Friday will cover what you need to know for the midterm.